For the third reading, I've chosen a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, where he's telling a whole bunch of parables. And there are three ways of listening to this reading. You can listen with your ears, you can listen with your mind, or you can listen with your soul. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered round him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they will have will be taken from them. This is why I speak in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. These are words inspired by God. The best stories of all are told in the dark, around the campfire, to a group. Failing that, you could tell them on a hillside, or even a boat will do, like today's gospel. In today's gospel, Jesus is preaching to the crowd, and there's a gather around him. They're suffocating him on the beach, so he gets into a boat and rows out a little bit, and then he's talking to them from the boat, while the crowd are, imagine, sitting on the beach. So I'm absolutely sure that Jesus, given that he was a peripatetic preacher or a mobile minister of the good news, that he told many, many a story around a campfire over the 3 years of his missionary work. So I can see him again and again and again as he's traveling throughout Judea and Samaria and Galilee with a group of followers, and they're camped out night after night. I can see them sitting around the fire and Jesus telling stories or parables. And contrary to what Matthew included in today's account, I do not believe that Jesus immediately explained to them what the parable meant. I think rather that he was operating in a kind of a Socratic method by telling stories or asking questions and then allowing people to figure out for themselves, what does it mean? So I can well imagine that at the end of each parable, as they're sitting around the fire, that he goes around and says, what do you think I meant by this parable? And one by one, the disciples get to to exegete it or to unpack it according to their own understanding. And that's the difference then between just hearing it with your ears, hearing it with your mind, or hearing it with your heart. So for the month of February, as you know, I take a theme for each month. For the month of February, I want to look at the notion of Jesus' use of parables. So today, in order to create the context for it, so I'm a big believer that in order to speak to any topic, you have to give a wider context initially, and then in concentric circles get smaller and smaller, and finally the bullseye is the target that you really want to expand on. And so in order to speak next Sunday in more depth about parables, I wanted today to try to create the larger context. And so today I'll talk firstly about the evolution of Earth consciousness. How does consciousness evolve on planet Earth from the beginning? And then secondly, the evolution of both oral and written languages. And then thirdly, language as a kind of a teaching spectrum. If you're trying to teach something to a group of people, what's the spectrum of language available to you? And then fourthly, I want to talk about the different eras and the different languages that people have used about God over the millennia. And then next Sunday, God willing, I'll take a deep, deep dive into the mystical messages of Jesus, and I'll cover the topics of the purpose of parables. And then I want to talk about Jesus as the master of parable and paradox. Nobody does it better. I want to talk next Sunday about the cultural and the translation problems when we're trying to elucidate in English what Jesus was saying. He would have been speaking Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of the synagogue, like Latin used to be the language of the liturgy and the Mass, but Jesus would have been speaking Aramaic. So when you translate from Aramaic into Greek, which in which the New Testament is written, and then from Greek into Latin, and then from Latin into English, we got cultural and translation problems. I want to talk about those. And then finally, next Sunday, I want to unpack a few of the parables, particularly the ones that have the theme of the master, servant, or the master and the slave, and unpack what does that actually mean when Jesus speaks it. So today, then, I'm going to start with the much, much wider context. And I want to examine for myself, how does consciousness evolve on planet Earth? The Earth itself is about 4.6 billion years of age. There's been life on the planet for 3.7, but it was a rock. It was a kind of a physiosphere initially. So I believe that God's love, incarnates in the cosmos in three distinct stages. The first stage is light. And we know, in fact, from physics that all matter is frozen light. It's composed of photons of light. So that was the first stage was light. The second stage was the logos. John calls it the logos, a Greek word that stands for the meaning. And the logos is what I would call the morphological agent. It is that which gives shape and form to light. Light is just matter. There's something that needs to shape it and to form it. And that is logos. That's the morphological agent. And then the third stage is life. And life then is the dance between light and logos. When light and logos dance, life emerges. So to use a simple an image for it, light is the clay, logos is the potter, and life is the finished product. So the potter starts off just with a bunch of clay. That's light. It's frozen light. And then the potter is the logos, the morphological agent that gives it shape. And then finally, life emerges. It's the finished product. It's a cup or a bowl or a vase, something like that. So there are the stages then through which the consciousness evolves. So initially then, we're looking at a rock, planet Earth, which is 4.6 billion years of age. And it consisted of inanimate matter, basically rocks and mountains and stuff like that. And rocks and mountains are inanimate in the sense that they're dependent upon chemical reactions to environmental influences. They have no movement of their own. They can't move on their own, or they can't grow on their own. So they're subject to chemical and environmental influences. So the rain has an effect, and the wind has an effect, and the snow, and earthquakes, and volcanoes, and waves. And so all movement for inanimate matter is from the outside. It's outside agents that create the changes in inanimate matter. So that's where we started off 4.6 billion years ago. And then life began to emerge. And the first great form of life is the flora. And now in the flora, flowers and grasses and stuff like that, there's the movement of life's forces in orientation. So there's a life force within the flora that are actually orienting. And so you look at a sunflower, and during the day, it'll orient to where the sun is actually shining. I get a lot of California poppies where I live up here. And it's fascinating that in the morning, they're all closed up completely. And then as the sun comes up, they begin to open. The 4 petals begin to expand. And then in the evening time, they close back down again. And so the movement is coming from inside in response to the movement of the sun outside. So flora like sunflowers or fungi or individual trees or even the forest ecosystem. The movement within this system is inner. It's an inner movement. It's not dependent upon outside forces. So that's the second great movement forward. At some stage, fauna arrived on the scene. And now the movement is not just a static, something which is grounded in the earth, that reorienting itself to the movement of the sun. But now there are moving feet and flippers and wings that allow the creature to completely relocate. So flowers can't relocate except by, scattering their seeds or hoping that bees, or insects carry them around. For the fauna, they've got feet or flippers or wings and they can relocate. Some birds will go literally 12,000 miles as they migrate from summer to winter. So that's the next great movement in this stage. Then at some stage, hominids arrive. And hominids probably, according to the recent calculation, are at least 6 million years old. And so now a hominid is a creature that's reacting consciously to present opportunities or present predicaments on the basis of previous experiences. So a hominid, whether it's a kind of a chimpanzee or a monkey or whatever, they're consciously reacting to present circumstances or present opportunities, present predicaments, because they've had previous experiences and they know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So that's the next stage. At some stage then, there are self-aware hominids, particularly human beings. So they're self-aware. So now we have the ability to self-reflect on the positive and negative impacts of previous behavior. So it's not just that we're faced with a present situation and we're going to respond to it, but we've got we have a track record. And so now, by being self-aware, we're able to reflect and choose our responses to present situations. So on the basis of the impacts of past behavior of ours, we made choices in the past, and we remember now what happened as a result, and now we're going to make choices now that reflect the behavior, the previous behavior, and the lessons that we learned from previous behavior. And then in the case of the human brain, the triune brain, so the human brain is in 3 parts. Back here, under the occipital lobe, you have the hindbrain, or the reptilian brain, the oldest part of the brain. And that's driven by instinctive physiological reactions to situations. It's what allows us to breathe. It's the movement of the bodily organs. And so it's a physiological reaction, and it is instinctive. We don't have to think about it. So reptiles like snakes and lizards operate in this fashion. And we've got that part of the human brain back here. Then there's the midbrain, or called the mammalian brain. And here we have not just physiological reactions, we have emotional reactions, and that becomes very important. So for instance, mammals are the first creatures that actually nurture their young. Reptiles don't nurture their young. Reptiles like, let's say, a snake will just lay a bunch of eggs and then move away, and the eggs are on their own. With mammals, for the first time ever, the mothers and the fathers look after the young when they're born. So there's an emotional connection to what they've given birth to. So that's the midbrain, or the mammalian brain. And then there's the forebrain, or the neocortex, where we have rational analysis and our ability to kind of figure out future events and create timelines in our minds. Now, I think there are 2 places beyond that. And the first one is sometimes called metacognition. And metacognition is the ability to factor in the effects, not just of previous behavior, but also previous motivations and desires. So we're not just reflecting, I did A in the past and B happened. If I don't like B, I'll stop doing A. So it's not just I can reflect on my behavior and remember what the outcome of the behavior was, But now with metacognition, I can actually look at previous motivations, even before I behaved in any fashion, the motives I had and the desires I had. And so look at what happens, when I give into particular kinds of motivations or desires. Is it good stuff or is it bad stuff? And then I'd like to invent a final term. I'm going to call it supercognition. And I believe that supercognition is the ability to see life, its evolution, and its teleology or purpose from a divine perspective. So we're not just looking at it from within the confines of the human brain. Supercognition for me is that we can see the totality of life. We can see its evolution and its purpose-driven teleology from a divine perspective. And I believe that it is from this level that the great mystical avatars, the Jesus figures and the Buddha figures and the Lao Tzu figures, it is from this level, this supercognition, that they're delivering their teachings. So it's not just coming out of rationality. When Jesus tells stories, he's not just telling stories from a very, very brilliant mind. He's telling it from a kind of a super cognitive perspective in which he's seeing stuff as God sees it. And that's the trick for the mystic, anybody wanting to get into mystical reality. So that for me then is kind of the outer shell. Until I understand that kind of trajectory of the development of consciousness, it won't make much sense to me to talk about stories. So that's kind of part of the context. So at some stage then, human beings developed language. So we have two forms basically. We've got oral languages and we've got written languages. So it seems that historically that Homo sapiens developed language, developed reason about 200,000 years ago. So 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was able to reason. It was a rational creature, but it didn't have language. That came much later. Language actually only arrived for human beings about 70,000 years ago. And so the difference between reason and language is that language is the ability to think about thinking. So our reason is the ability to think, and language is the ability to think about thinking, and then to express it either in words or in some kinds of images, either pictograms, or writing codes, or images, through drawings. And so written language then was much, much later. The oral languages came first. Written languages are fairly recent. So in order of kind of chronological order, the first form of written language was cuneiform, and it was developed in Sumeria, which would be modern-day Iraq. And it was developed about 3,200 BCE. So we're talking about like 5,200 years ago. Very, very shortly afterwards, the Egyptians developed hieroglyphics. It comes from about 3,100 BCE. So basically, it's about 5,100 years ago. And for thousands of years, there were the two kinds of scripts, but they're very difficult because there are hundreds of different symbols. So it was really difficult to master them. Then about the year 1100 BCE, the Phoenicians, brilliant geniuses, and also great seafaring people, they created a writing based on phonemes. So a phoneme is the shortest sound that the human voice can make. A phoneme is shorter than a syllable. And so, for instance, if you take the word I went to town yesterday, the word I is two phonemes. Just a single letter, but it's two phonemes. It is I. It's basically an A sound followed by an E sound. And they're put together very quickly, so it becomes I. And so a phoneme then is the shortest sound that the human voice can make. And the Phoenicians created a kind of, they called it an abjad. So a group of phonemes, they had only 22, and in their language, you only created 22 phonemes. There were only 22 basic sounds that the voice could make. And if you gave a symbol for each of these phonemes, then you could write any word you wanted in any language you wanted. Now, the difficulty was with the Phoenicians, they had 22 symbols, but there were no symbols for vowels. There was only symbols for the consonant sounds. So it's not, properly speaking, it's not an alphabet, it's called an abjad. So 22 symbols for the consonants. The Greeks added the vowel signs, and then it became known as the alphabet. And so they added symbols for the vowel signs as well. Now, the language that Jesus would have been speaking was Aramaic. And Aramaic then, as Hebrew does, has only 22 symbols, because basically Aramaic and Hebrew are abjads. They're not alphabets. So even in modern Hebrew today, if you read a modern Israeli newspaper, there are no vowel signs in it. You have to infer the vowels. They're only consonants, so it's basically an abjad rather than an alphabet. In my own case, Gaelic has 20 symbols, and it's written in a language called Ogham, O-G-H-A-M. And very often it was written on the corners of large standing stones, which are still visible today in Ireland. There are thousands of them still survived in Ireland with the etching on the edges, and you'll see cattle scratching themselves off it. So there's a big dispute among scholars as to how ancient Ogham is. Some people putting it back as far as 600 BCE, and others claiming, no, it comes from about 300 CE or AD. But whatever it was, the Celts and the Druids preferred the oral tradition to the writing. Now, some languages then came into being and disappeared. So the oldest languages which are still spoken on planet Earth are the following. So if you look at the languages spoken on planet Earth now, a lot of them are quite new. So if you wanted to figure out what are the oldest languages that are still spoken on planet Earth, then you'd have to start with Egyptian. Modern Egyptian goes back to 2690 BCE. So it's about 4,700 years old. So it's the oldest language on the planet which has been in use the longest. The second one is Sanskrit. It goes back to about 1500 BCE. So it's about 3,500 years old. The next one is Greek. It goes back to about 1450 BCE. So it's now about 3,500 years old as well. Chinese comes next. Chinese, it was invented about 1250 BCE, so it's about 3,300 years old. Then Aramaic is next. Aramaic was developed about 1100 BCE, so it's like 3,100 years old. And then Hebrew came about 100 years after Aramaic. So Hebrew is about 3,000 years old. And that's an interesting language because it flourished between about 1000 BCE and 200 CE in the modern era, and then it went extinct. And then in 1800 CE, it was developed again. So after a lapse of 1600 years, a dead language was revived and is now spoken in Israel. Language number 7, as far as age is concerned, is Farsi, and it goes back to 522 BC. So it's about 2,500 years old. The next one is Tamil, which is spoken in Ceylon, I believe, or Sri Lanka. And that goes back to 300 BCE. So it's about 2,300 years old. The next one is Korean, which goes back to 57 BCE. So it's about 2,100 years old. And then Italian, which goes back to 100 BCE. So that too is about 2,100 years old. And then finally, Arabic, developed about 100 in the Common Era. So it's about 1,900 years of age. Now, so that's the evolution then of both the written forms of it and the oral forms of language. Now, when you look then at the way in which language has been used as a teaching mechanism, there's lots of different things that we employ when we're trying to use language in order to teach a message of some kind. So I'm going to just list some of the the ways in which we use language. The first one is, I'll mention, is the epic. So the epic, very typically, when you look at cultures, the epic is a very long poem which is derived from some ancient oral tradition, that's telling the heroic adventures of either a legendary figure or the history of a nation. So an epic, it tends to be much longer, obviously, and very often it's in a poetic form. Our common or garden story then is just an account of either imaginary or real people, and typically it's used for purposes of entertainment. When you look at a vignette is typically a very brief, evocative description or episode. So it tends to be much shorter than your typical story. A metaphor then is where you use the qualities of one thing figuratively and carry it over to another. You say somebody is a couch potato. So you're using qualities of a person, a couch, and a potato, and you're putting them together in order to create some kind of a message. Allegory is a little bit bigger than a metaphor. So allegory is a story or a poem or a picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. And very typically, it's a moral or a political meaning when you use allegory. Simile is a figure of speech that involves the comparison of one thing with another of a different kind in order to lend kind of emphasis to what you're saying. So you talk about somebody being as brave as a lion. So it always has an as component in it when it's a simile. A proverb then is a kind of a a short, pithy saying in general use, stating a general truth or a piece of advice, like look before you leap. So that's your typical proverb. And then a parable, the final one, is a simple story used to kind of illustrate a moral or a spiritual lesson. And Jesus is an expert in all of these. He's really, really good. But where he really, really shines is in the parable. And I'll focus on that in a big way next Sunday, God willing. So in the meantime, I want to look at how have we used language in our attempts to talk about God. So I believe that there are kind of various stages to our human beings wrestling with the notion of the divine. So the first era I call the era of the theologians. And theologians are speaking about the gods, and it's always plural when you go really, really back. And it's called cataphatic language, which means they're trying rational explanations for what they don't understand. So they're trying to use reason in order to figure out who the gods are. So it's very much a left brain activity in which there's individuation and separation between the subject and the object of the study. So that would be the first era, the era of the theologians. The second era I would call the era of the priests. So now you're not talking about the gods. The priests aren't talking about the gods. They're speaking to the gods. So they invent prayer and they invent ritual. And there'll be a lot of kind of metaphorical movement like dancing, etc., in order to establish this communication with the gods. The third stage, I believe, and I call it the era of the prophets. So where the theologians are speaking about the gods and the priests are speaking to the gods, the prophets are speaking on behalf of the gods. They're purporting to speak on behalf of some divinity. And their function, I keep saying this, is the real function of the prophet is not to foretell the future, but to forestall the future. It is not to predict the future, but to prevent the future, because the prophet can see where we're headed and is attempting to prevent that. Then the next stage is the language of teachers. So teachers have to use some kind of symbolic or parabolic language in order to wrestle with the transcendence of the divine. And the last stage then is the mystic. And the mystics are using what's being called apophatic language. So this is the language of the mystical or the awakened. So it's the language of neti neti in Hinduism. X, no, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, no, God is not Z. So you're trying to back yourself into the experience of the divine, eschewing reason completely. And that's the function of the Zen koan. There is no rational kind of exegesis of a Zen koan. When the Zen koan says, what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? There's no rational response to that. So you have to back yourself away from reason into the experience of the divine. So this then is a right brain, unitive, creative experience. Now, Jesus, when you look at his teaching, is using all of these parts. And so next week, I'd pick up on his unique contribution and his teaching style. But he's looking at all of these ways of trying to address the message. But primarily, he's focused on the kind of the apophatic and on the parabolic, where he's going to use stories and metaphors and allegories in order to get people out of their minds and into their souls. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.